Methodology. We have defined terrorism here as acts of violence intentionally perpetrated on civilian non-combatants with the goal of furthering some ideological, religious, or political objective. Our principal focus is on non-state actors. Our task was to identify and analyze the scientific and professional social science literature pertaining to the psychological and/or behavioral dimensions of terrorist behavior, not on victimization or effects. Our objectives were to explore what questions pertaining to terrorist groups and behavior had been asked by social science researchers, to identify the main findings from that research, and attempt to distill and summarize them within a framework of operationally relevant questions. Search strategy. To identify the relevant social science literature, we began by searching a series of major academic databases using a systematic, iterative keyword strategy, mapping, where possible, onto existing subject headings. The focus was on locating professional social science literature published in major books or in peer-reviewed journals. The following database searches were conducted in October 2003. Sociophile/sociological abstracts. Criminal Justice Abstracts, CJ Abstracts. Criminal Justice Periodical Index, CJPI. National Criminal Justice Reference Service Abstracts, NCJRS. PsycInfo. Medline. Public Affairs Information Service, PIUS. The hit count from those searches is summarized in the table below. After the initial list was generated, we cross-checked the citations against the reference list of several major review works that had been published in the preceding 5 years, e.g., Rex Hudson's The Psychology and Sociology of Terrorism I, and included potentially relevant references that were not already on the list. Finally, the list was submitted to the 3 senior academic consultants on the project, Dr. Martha Crenshaw, Dr. John Horgan, and Dr. Andrew Silka, soliciting recommendations based only on relevance, not merit, as to whether any of the citations listed should be removed and whether they knew of others that met the criteria that should be added. Reviews mainly suggested additions, rarely recommending removal, to the list. Revisions were made in response to reviewer comments, and the remaining comprised our final citation list. Annotations. 3 types of annotations are provided for works in this bibliography. Author's abstract. This is the abstract of the work as provided, and often published, by the author. If available, it is provided even if another annotation also is included. Editor's annotation. This is an annotation written by the editor of this bibliography. Key quote summary. This is an annotation composed of key quotes from the original work, edited to provide a cogent overview of its main points. PsycInfo Medline CJPI NCJRS CJ Abstracts PAIS Sociophile Terrorism 50 Terror * KW 844-1353 Not applicable 2115 Terror * KW and Mindset 1 0 0 4 0 Boolean 33 0 10 0 2 0 0 Terror * KW and Psych * KW not applicable 428 141 not applicable Terrorism and Mindset not applicable 1 not applicable Psychology sub and Terror * KW 5017 0 not applicable Psychology sub and Terrorism sub 3511 0 not applicable Psychology and Terrorism not applicable Boolean 154 0 142328 Political Violence KW 55764 0 89 0 Boolean 1950 not applicable Political Violence KW and Psychology not applicable 10 0 149 Numbers equals total results n/a equals search term unnecessary 0 equals no items were kept from the results KW equals keyword. Project team. Project director, Dr. Randy Borum, University of South Florida. Senior advisors, Dr. Robert Fine, National Violence Prevention and Study Center /CIFA, Mr. Brian Vosaquil, National Violence Prevention and Study Center /CIFA. Senior consultants, Dr. Martha Crenshaw, Wesleyan University, Dr. John Horgan, University College at Cork, Dr. Andrew Silka, UK Home Office, Dr. Michael Gels, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, Dr. Scott Schmate, Counterintelligence Field Activity, CIFA. Centra Lee Zinsser, Vice President, Bonnie Co., Senior Analyst. Reference list. 1. Root causes of terrorism. International expert meeting in Also, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Call number, key quote summary. An international panel of leading experts on terrorism met in Oslo to discuss root causes of terrorism. The main purpose was to provide inputs from the research community to a high-level conference on fighting terrorism for humanity to be held in New York on September 22, 2003. The findings described below are conclusions drawn by the chairman on the basis of presentations and discussions. A main accomplishment of the expert panel was to invalidate several widely held ideas about what causes terrorism. There was broad agreement that there is only a weak and indirect relationship between poverty and terrorism. At the individual level, terrorists are generally not drawn from the poorest segments of their societies. Typically, they are at average or over-average levels in terms of education and socioeconomic background. Poor people are more likely to take part in simpler forms of political violence than terrorism, such as riots. The level of terrorism is not particularly high in the poorest countries of the world. Terrorism is more commonly associated with countries with a medium level of economic development, often emerging in societies characterized by rapid modernization and transition. On the other hand, poverty has frequently been used as justification for social revolutionary terrorists, who may claim to represent the poor and marginalized without being poor themselves. Although not a root cause of terrorism, poverty is a social evil that should be fought for its own reasons. State sponsorship is not a root cause of terrorism. Used as an instrument in their foreign policies, some states have capitalized on pre-existing terrorist groups rather than creating them. Terrorist groups have often been the initiators of these relationships, at times courting several potential state sponsors in order to enhance their own independence. State sponsorship is clearly an enabling factor of terrorism, giving terrorist groups a far greater capacity and lethality than they would have had on their own. States have exercised varying degrees of control over the groups they have sponsored, ranging from using terrorists as guns for hire to having virtually no influence at all over their operations. Tight state control is rare. Also, Western democratic governments have occasionally supported terrorist organizations as a foreign policy means. Suicide terrorism is not caused by religion, or more specifically Islam, as such. Many suicide terrorists around the world are secular, or belong to other religions than Islam. Suicide terrorists are motivated mainly by political goals, usually to end foreign occupation or domestic domination by a different ethnic group. Their martyrdom is, however, frequently legitimized and glorified with reference to religious ideas and values. Terrorists are not insane or irrational actors. Symptoms of psychopathology are not common among terrorists. Neither do suicide terrorists, as individuals, possess the typical risk factors of suicide. There is no common personality profile that characterizes most terrorists, who appear to be relatively normal individuals. Terrorists may follow their own rationalities based on extremist ideologies or particular terrorist logics, but they are not irrational. What causes terrorism? The notion of terrorism is applied to a great diversity of groups with different origins and goals. Terrorism occurs in wealthy countries as well as in poor countries, in democracies as well as in authoritarian states. Thus, there exists no single root cause of terrorism, or even a common set of causes. There are, however, a number of preconditions and precipitants for the emergence of various forms of terrorism. One limitation of the root cause approach is the underlying idea that terrorists are just passive pawns of the social, economic, and psychological forces around them doing what these causes compel them to do. It is more useful to see terrorists as rational and intentional actors who develop deliberate strategies to achieve political objectives. They make their choices between different options and tactics, on the basis of the limitations and possibilities of the situation. Terrorism is better understood as emerging from a process of interaction between different parties than as a mechanical cause and effect relationship. With these reservations in mind, it is nevertheless useful to try to identify some conditions and circumstances that give rise to terrorism, or that at least provide a fertile ground for radical groups wanting to use terrorist methods to achieve their objectives. One can distinguish between preconditions and precipitants as two ends of a continuum. Preconditions set the stage for terrorism in the long run. They are of a relatively general and structural nature, producing a wide range of social outcomes of which terrorism is only one. Preconditions alone are not sufficient to cause the outbreak of terrorism. Precipitants are much more directly affecting the emergence of terrorism. These are the specific events or situations that immediately precede, motivate, or trigger the outbreak of terrorism. The first set of causes listed below have more character of being preconditions, whereas the latter causes are closer to precipitants. The following list is not all-inclusive. Lack of democracy, civil liberties, and the rule of law is a precondition for many forms of domestic terrorism. The relationship between government coercion and political violence is essentially shaped like an inverted U. The most democratic and the most totalitarian societies have the lowest levels of oppositional violence. Moderate levels of coercive violence from the government tend to fuel the fire of dissent, while dissident activities can be brought down by governments willing to resort to extreme forces of coercive brutality. Such draconian force is beyond the limits of what democratic nations are willing to use, and rightfully so. Failed or weak states lack the capacity or will to exercise territorial control and maintain a monopoly of violence. This leaves a power vacuum that terrorist organizations may exploit to maintain safe havens, training facilities, and bases for launching terrorist operations. On the other hand, terrorists may also find safe havens and carry out support functions in strong and stable democracies, due to the greater liberties that residents enjoy there. Rapid modernization in the form of high economic growth has also been found to correlate strongly with the emergence of ideological terrorism, but not with ethno-nationalist terrorism. This may be particularly important in countries where sudden wealth, e.g. from oil, has precipitated a change from tribal to high-tech societies in one generation or less. When traditional norms and social patterns crumble or are made to seem irrelevant, new radical ideologies, sometimes based on religion and/or nostalgia for a glorious past, may become attractive to certain segments of society. Modern society also facilitates terrorism by providing access to rapid transportation and communication, news media, weapons, etc. Extremist ideologies of a secular or religious nature are at least an intermediate cause of terrorism, although people usually adopt such extremist ideologies as a consequence of more fundamental political or personal reasons. When these worldviews are adopted and applied in order to interpret situations and guide action, they tend to take on a dynamics of their own, and may serve to dehumanize the enemy and justify atrocities. Historical antecedents of political violence, civil wars, revolutions, dictatorships, or occupation may lower the threshold for acceptance of political violence and terrorism, and impede the development of nonviolent norms among all segments of society. The victim role, as well as long-standing historical injustices and grievances, may be constructed to serve as justifications for terrorism. When young children are socialized into cultural value systems that celebrate martyrdom, revenge, and hatred of other ethnic or national groups, this is likely to increase their readiness to support or commit violent atrocities when they grow up. Hegemony and inequality of power. When local or international powers possess an overwhelming power compared to oppositional groups, and the latter see no other realistic ways to forward their cause by normal political or military means, asymmetrical warfare can represent a tempting option. Terrorism offers the possibility of achieving high political impact with limited means. Illegitimate or corrupt governments frequently give rise to opposition that may turn to terrorist means if other avenues are not seen as realistic options for replacing these regimes with a more credible and legitimate government or a regime which represents the values and interests of the opposition movement. Powerful external actors upholding illegitimate governments may be seen as an insurmountable obstacle to needed regime change. Such external support to illegitimate governments is frequently seen as foreign domination through puppet regimes serving the political and economic interests of foreign sponsors. Repression by foreign occupation or by colonial powers has given rise to a great many national liberation movements that have sought recourse in terrorist tactics, guerrilla warfare, and other political means. Despite their use of terrorist methods, some liberation movements enjoy considerable support and legitimacy among their own constituencies, and sometimes also from segments of international public opinion. The experience of discrimination on the basis of ethnic or religious origin is the chief root cause of ethno-nationalist terrorism. When sizable minorities are systematically deprived of their rights to equal social and economic opportunities, obstructed from expressing their cultural identities, e.g., forbidden to use their language or practice their religion, or excluded from political influence, this can give rise to secessionist movements that may turn to terrorism or other forms of violent struggle. Ethnic nationalisms are more likely to give rise to, and justify, terrorism than are moderate and inclusive civic nationalisms. Failure or unwillingness by the state to integrate dissident groups or emerging social classes may lead to their alienation from the political system. Some groups are excluded because they hold views or represent political traditions considered irreconcilable with the basic values of the state. Large groups of highly educated young people with few prospects of meaningful careers within a blocked system will tend to feel alienated and frustrated. Excluded groups are likely to search for alternative channels through which to express and promote political influence and change. To some, terrorism can seem the most effective and tempting option. The experience of social injustice is a main motivating cause behind social revolutionary terrorism. Relative deprivation or great differences in income distribution, rather than absolute deprivation or poverty, in a society have in some studies been found to correlate rather strongly with the emergence of social revolutionary political violence and terrorism, but less with ethno-nationalist terrorism. The presence of charismatic ideological leaders able to transform widespread grievances and frustrations into a political agenda for violent struggle is a decisive factor behind the emergence of a terrorist movement or group. The existence of grievances alone is only a precondition. Someone is needed who can translate that into a program for violent action. Triggering events are the direct precipitators of terrorist acts. Such a trigger can be an outrageous act committed by the enemy, lost wars, massacres, contested elections, police brutality, or other provocative events that call for revenge or action. Even peace talks may trigger terrorist action by spoilers on both sides. Individuals join extremist groups for different reasons. Some are true believers who are motivated by ideology and political goals, whereas others get involved for selfish interests, or because belonging to a strong group is important to their identity. Factors sustaining terrorism. Terrorism is often sustained for reasons other than those which gave birth to it in the first place. It is therefore not certain that terrorism will end even if the grievances that gave rise to it, or the root causes, are somehow dealt with. Terrorist groups may change purpose, goals, and motivation over time. Cycles of revenge. As a response to terrorist atrocities, reprisals are generally popular with broad segments of the public. However, this tends to be the case on both sides, which often try to outdo each other in taking revenge to satisfy their respective constituencies. Deterrence does often not work against non-state terrorist actors. Violent reprisals may even have the opposite effect of deterrence because many terrorist groups want to provoke overreactions. Policies of military reprisal to terrorist actions may become an incentive to more terrorism, as uncompromising militants seek to undermine moderation and political compromise. The need of the group to provide for its members or for the survival of the group itself may also cause a terrorist group to change its main objectives or to continue its struggle longer than it otherwise would have, e.g. to effect the release of imprisoned members or to sustain its members economically. Profitable criminal activities to finance their political and terrorist campaigns may eventually give terrorist groups vested interests in continuing their actions long after they realize that their political Cause is lost. Alternatively, some continue even if many of their political demands have been met. No exit. With blood on their hands and having burnt all bridges back to mainstream society, some terrorist groups and individuals continue their underground struggle because the only alternative is long-term imprisonment or death. Serious consideration should be given to ways of bringing the insurgent movement back into the political process, or at least offering individual terrorists a way out, such as reduced sentences or amnesty, if they break with their terrorist past and cooperate with the authorities. Such policies have in fact helped to bring terrorism to an end in several countries. 2. Abdullah, S. 2002. The Soul of Terrorist. C. E. Stout, ed. The Psychology of Terrorism, A Public Understanding, Volume 1 pp. 129-141. Westport, Connecticut, Praeger Publishers. Call number, key quote summary. What motivates people to strap plastic explosives to their bodies, go to a public place, and detonate? Are they soulless criminals? Are they insane fanatics? Or is something else going on? The goal of this chapter is to help us see what is right in front of our faces. The reflections of this chapter are designed to help us reframe our thinking about the issue of terrorism, to help us see the issue with new eyes and a new heart. Specifically, the author examines the nature of terrorism, belief systems, and transitional steps to be taken in order to reduce the spread of terrorism. 3. Adigun Lawal, C. 2002. Social Psychological Considerations in the Emergence and Growth of Terrorism. C. E. Stout, ed. The Psychology of Terrorism, Programs and Practices in Response and Prevention, Volume 3. Westport, Connecticut, Praeger Publishers. Call number, editor's annotation. In this article, the author explicates terrorism as a form of deviant behavior. The initial focus is on how terrorist attitudes may develop in individuals. These attitudes are composed of cognitions, affects, and desire to engage in certain behaviors. Lawal uses Hofstede's 4 dimensions of culture to describe how sociocultural factors may influence a process of socializing terrorists. 2 core culture-dependent attributes of terrorists are dogmatism and a sense of helplessness, which are caused by a lack of a sense of independence, lack of assertiveness, and low self-esteem. 4. Akhtar, S. 1999. The Psychodynamic Dimension of Terrorism. Psychiatric Annals, 29, 6, 350-355. Call number, editor's annotation. This article examines how psychodynamic characteristics of terrorist leaders and their followers are delineated, suing concepts from both individuals and group psychology. Some parallels between the terrorist violence against peace-seeking forces and certain patients' destructive attacks on the psychotherapeutic process are demonstrated. Evidence does exist that most major players in a terrorist organization are themselves deeply traumatized individuals. As children, they suffered chronic physical abuse and profound emotional humiliation. They grew up mistrusting others, loathing passivity, and dreading reoccurrence of a violation of their psychophysical boundaries. To eliminate this fear, such individuals feel the need to kill off their view of themselves as victims. A terrorism-prone individual is pushed over the edge by a trigger from the environment. The vulnerable individual's self-esteem mobilizes his narcissistic rage and propels him toward establishing or joining a terrorist organization. Like most groups, a terrorist organization consists of a leader and his followers. The leader is usually a traumatized but charismatic individual. The followers are usually inhibited young men, equally traumatized themselves and struggling to achieve a sense of selfhood and a cohesive identity. This helps his followers shift their aggression toward those outside the group. This enhances group cohesion, which, in turn, furthers the leader's grip on the members. 2 cardinal features of group psychology, namely intensifies affect and diminished intellectual acumen, contribute to the regression set in motion by the group leader. Individual members lose their previous sense of values on the altar. The cohesion of a terrorist group is furthered by the overt or covert financial aid and praise, shock, and horror of the victims, notoriety achieved through public media. The terrorist organization cannot afford to succeed at its surface agenda. If the group were to succeed, it would no longer be needed. The terrorist leader unconsciously aims for the impossible. 5. Al-Qatar, A. M. 2003. Religion and Terrorism, An Interfaith Perspective. New York, Praeger Publishers. Call number, editor's annotation. Al-Qatar spent 15 years with the Jordanian intelligence service before pursuing his graduate education in the U.S. His doctoral dissertation forms the basis for this book. He sought to understand religious justifications for violence within Jewish, Christian, and Islamic doctrine and traditions. He interviewed religious leaders from each of these groups, approximately 24 in all, with attempts to get multiple representatives from each of the major sects of each religion, looking for thematic consistency in how terrorism might be legitimized as a tactic. For that would justify violence, not necessarily terrorism, emerged across most religious traditions, engagement in just war, a rubric imposed by the author to describe the conditions of conflict. Articulated by the leaders, preventing future violence, defense of self or others, endorsed as a justification across all 3 religions, if it was the only means available to defend those lives, controlling the land, heard from the Muslim and Jewish leaders. This distillation is probably the main contribution to emerge from Al-Qatar's original research. 6. Alexander, Y. and Gleason, J. M. 1981. Behavioral and Quantitative Perspectives on Terrorism. New York, Pergamon. Call number, editor's annotation. This volume was one of the earlier compilations of practical reviews on behavioral aspects of terrorism. Although it includes chapters from some recognizable names in the field, including Brian Jenkins, Fred Hacker, and Gene Knutson, it also reflects the very nascent state of knowledge and prevailing reliance during that period on psychoanalytically related formulations. The chapter by Tom Strentz, I believe, marked the first appearance of his oft-noted organizational profile of terrorist groups being composed of leaders, activist operators, and idealists. The book does contain a few attempts to bring a statistical analysis to bear on the problem, perhaps more effort even than many contemporary texts, but 25 years hence, there is little wisdom here that has not been repeated many times over or been superseded by subsequent analyses. 7. Ardila, R. 2002. The Psychology of the Terrorist, Behavioral Perspectives. C. E. Stout, ed. The Psychology of Terrorism, A Public Understanding Psychological Dimensions to War and Peace, Volume 1 pp. 9-15. Westport, Connecticut, Prieger Publishers/Greenwood Publishing Group. Call number, key quote summary. This chapter concentrates on the psychology of individuals who commit terrorist acts. This is done from the point of view of behavioral psychology, in particular of the experimental analysis of behavior and post-Skinnerian developments. The field of work is the social context, the cultural contingencies, and in general the behavioral analysis of social issues. This work is based on social language theory, on the behavioral analysis of cognition and language, on rule government behavior, and on the experimental synthesis of behavior. 8. Atran, S. 2003. Genesis of Suicide Terrorism. Science, 299, 5612, 1534-1539. Call number, key quote summary, author's abstract. Contemporary suicide terrorists from the Middle East are publicly deemed crazed cowards bent on senseless destruction who thrive in poverty and ignorance. Recent research indicates they have no appreciable psychopathology and are as educated and economically well-off as surrounding populations. A first line of defense is to get the communities from which suicide attackers stem to stop the attacks by learning how to minimize the receptivity of mostly ordinary people to recruiting organizations. Suicide attack is an ancient practice with a modern history, supporting online text. Its use by the Jewish sect of Zealots, Sikhori, in Roman-occupied Judea and by the Islamic Order of Assassins, Hashishin, during the early Christian Crusades are legendary examples. Whether subnational, e.g., Russian anarchists, or state-supported suicide attack as a weapon of terror is usually chosen by weaker parties against materially stronger foes when fighting methods of lesser cost seem unlikely to succeed. According to Jane's Intelligence Review, all the suicide terrorist groups have support infrastructures in Europe and North America. Calling the current wave of radical Islam fundamentalism, in the sense of traditionalism, is misleading, approaching an oxymoron. A first line of defense is to prevent people from becoming terrorists. What research there is, however, indicates that suicide terrorists have no appreciable psychopathology and are at least as educated and economically well-off as their surrounding populations. For U.S. Senator John Warner, preemptive assaults on terrorists and those supporting terrorism are justified because those who would commit suicide in their assaults on the free world are not rational and are not deterred by rational concepts. Suicide terrorists generally are not lacking in legitimate life opportunities relative to their general population. As the Arab press emphasizes, if martyrs had nothing to lose, sacrifice would be senseless. He who commits suicide kills himself for his own benefit. He who commits martyrdom sacrifices himself for the sake of his religion and his nation. The mujahid is full of hope. Although humiliation and despair may help account for susceptibility to martyrdom in some situations, this is neither a complete explanation nor one applicable to other circumstances. Studies by psychologist Ariel Merari point to the importance of institutions in suicide terrorism. His team interviewed 32 of 34 bomber families in Palestine/Israel before 1998, surviving attackers, and captured recruiters. Suicide terrorists apparently span their population's normal distribution in terms of education, socioeconomic status, and personality type, introvert versus extrovert. Mean age for bombers was early 20s. Almost all were unmarried and expressed religious belief before recruitment, but no more than did the general population. Except for being young, unattached males, suicide bombers differ from members of violent racist organizations with whom they are often compared. Overall, suicide terrorists exhibit no socially dysfunctional attributes, fatherless, friendless, or jobless, or suicidal symptoms. They do not vent fear of enemies or express hopelessness or a sense of nothing to lose for lack of life alternatives. That would be consistent with economic rationality. From 1996 to 1999, Nusra Hassan, a Pakistani relief worker, interviewed nearly 250 Palestinian recruiters and trainers, failed suicide bombers, and relatives of deceased bombers. Bombers were men aged 18 to 38, none were uneducated, desperately poor, simple-minded, or depressed. They all seemed to be entirely normal members of their families. Yet all were deeply religious, believing their actions sanctioned by the divinely revealed religion of Islam. In contrast to Palestinians, surveys with a control group of Bosnian Muslim adolescents from the same time period reveal markedly weaker expressions of self-esteem, hope for the future, and prosocial behavior. Thus, a critical factor determining suicide terrorism behavior is arguably loyalty to intimate cohorts of peers, which recruiting organizations often promote through religious communion. But for leaders who almost never consider killing themselves, despite declarations of readiness to die, material benefits more likely outweigh losses in martyrdom operations. The first line of defense is to drastically reduce receptivity of potential recruits to recruiting organizations. But how? It is important to know what probably will not work. Raising literacy rates may have no effect and could be counterproductive. Lessening poverty may have no effect and could be counterproductive. Ending occupation or reducing perceived humiliation may help, but not if the population believes this to be a victory inspired by terror. If suicide bombing is crucially, though not exclusively, an institution-level phenomenon, it may require finding the right mix of pressure and inducements to get the communities themselves to abandon support for institutions that recruit suicide attackers. Are there reliable differences between religious and secular groups, or between ideologically driven and grievance-driven terrorism? Interviews with surviving Hamas bombers and captured Al-Qaeda. Operatives suggest that ideology and grievance are factors for both groups, but relative weights and consequences may differ. 9. Bayber, A.S. 1990. Contemporary Islamic Revivalism, a Movement or Moment. Journal of Arab Affairs, 9, 122-146. Call number, editor's annotation, written in 1990 by Dean of Education at King Saud University and self-proclaimed Islamic revivalist. Agrees Islamic revivalism has been declining in influence. Calls for renewal usually begins with negative themes, but to evolve into a movement must have a positive core. Negative trends typically has 3 themes. 1. Ummah is totally debilitated, rhetoric of exaggeration. 2. Cause of debilitation is westernization, therefore of scapegoating. 3. Any alienism, e.g., materialism, socialism, cannot offer anything to solution in Islamic countries and can be easily dismissed as being flawed. Rhetoric of straw man. Argues Islamic revivalism has been unable to move from negative to positive because his message lacks direction. Offers suggestions to move contemporary Islam revivalism forward by countering the 3 negative themes. 10. Bayerkat, W. D. Claessens, H. F. and Neidhart, F. eds. 1982, Analysen zum Terrorismus 3, Gruppers S. Opeladen, Westdeutscher Verlag. Call number, translation not available. 11. Bandura, A. 2003. The Origins and Consequences of Moral Disengagement, A Social Learning Perspective. F. M. Mogadam and A. J. Marcella, eds. Understanding Terrorism, Psychosocial Roots, Consequences, and Interventions. Washington, D.C., American Psychological Association. Call number, key quote summary. This essay explores the intellectual artifacts and mechanisms that enable terrorists to do what they do, to kill indiscriminately in the name of political, social, or cultural causes. While it is widely recognized that there are no neat explanations of terrorism, that has not deterred research that seeks to discover underlying causes in the makeup of the terrorist personality. Without presuming too much, it is fair to say that a psychologist begins with an individual whose characteristic way of behaving is formed out of a complex interaction between emotional and neurological materials and social experiences. In his comprehensive review of terrorism, Lacour 1987 notes that the analyses of motivations are as numerous and diverse as are the definitions and myriad forms of the phenomenon. Friedman observes that a psychological profile of a model terrorist cannot be drawn. The personalities are disparate. We now turn to techniques of emotional concealment that enable the violent to rid themselves of the terrorist taint. To engage openly in indiscriminate violence, the individual must morally disengage. In this regard, Bandura's model of the socio-psychological process is instructive. The conversion process of the socialized into dedicated revolutionaries is not only achieved by altering their personality structures, aggressive drives, or even moral standards. By cognitively restructuring the moral value of crimes committed against specific groups so that they can be done free from censoring doubt, the tasks of making violence morally defensible is facilitated. Responsibility can also be diffused such that an emotional division of labor can occur. Terrorist organizations are created, and this means that there is a fractional compartmentalization of tasks. Moreover, decision-making in a hierarchy of authority may easily induce otherwise sensitive individuals to behave inhumanely because no single person need feel responsible for policies arrived at collectively or imposed by distant, unknown others in the organization's leadership cadres. Immersion in the group's ideology, specifically in its dehumanization of the enemy, can deaden moral sensibilities. The mesmerizing power of an ideology is not limited to politically desperate and nav individuals ready to cling to any set of ideas that promise relief from despair. Unlike more group-restricted or privatized paradigms, ideologies are a rhetoric of public discourse and produce what may be called dramaturgic accentuation. Ideologically inspired political programs drive contemporary movements that are labeled terrorist. Ideologies would appear to be basic foundational elements in cultivating the motivational structure and mindset of the believer/adherent. The importance of a socially inspired belief system resides in its power to communicate ideals, evaluations, and goals among group members. A major feature of ideological thought is the historical consciousness it breeds among those who embrace it. Ideologies are thus concerned with things to come. As a method of interpretation, ideologies must possess some logic. As programs of actions, terrorist insurgencies are rarely isolated phenomena. They tend to reflect diffuse sympathies, desires, and aspirations of larger segments of society. Ideology plays a role in sculpting the social universe. It aids by providing names, predicates, gestures, pictures, and interpretations of events. The recipe knowledge of ideology rewrites history in the interest of a political agenda, and enables the terrorist to restructure social reality in ways that lend themselves to revolutionary interventions. To the extent that the organization and its social and political theories become the grounding of identity, the task of the terrorist then is not simply an empirical one of proselytizing, more is involved. First, there is the job of spreading the word. Secondly, one must do what is needed, which often entails defending the group against those who seek to discredit it. Whether the strategies of disobedience involve only symbolic protest or lead social movements, they seek to persuade the political leadership that it must attend to the opposition's proposals so that modifications and changes satisfactory to all parties can be achieved. If a group believes it is treated unjustly, if the political process is unresponsive and offers little realistic hope for reversing or changing laws and policies that are deeply resented and offensive, and finally, if nonviolent acts of civil disobedience do not work to produce desired results or prospects of change, then, given the strength of the group's convictions and the realistic appraisal of demographic and political considerations, terror would seem to be the ultimate resort to weaken, to arouse, and to stimulate others to action. The civil disobedient accept the responsibility of lawbreaking, but deny the responsibility of blameworthiness. They differ from the terrorist not only in their nonviolence, but also in another factor, the road to the goal. 12. Bandura, A. 1990. The role of selective mechanisms of moral disengagement in terrorism and counterterrorism. W. Reich, ed. Origins of Terrorism, Psychologies, Ideologies, Theologies, States of Mind, pages 161 to 191. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press. Call number, key quote summary, self-sanction plays a central role in the regulation of inhumane conduct. In the course of socialization, people adopt moral standards that serve as guides and deterrents for conduct. Once internalized control has developed, people regulate their actions by the sanctions they apply to themselves. They do things that give them satisfaction and build their sense of self-worth. They refrain from behaving in ways that violate their moral standards, because such behavior would bring self-condemnation. Self-sanctions thus keep conduct in line with internal standards. But moral standards do not function as fixed internal regulators of conduct. Self-regulatory mechanisms do not operate unless they are activated, and there are many psychological processes by which moral reactions can be disengaged from inhumane conduct. Self-sanctions can be disengaged by reconstruing conduct as serving moral purposes, by obscuring personal agency in detrimental activities, by disregarding or misrepresenting the injurious consequences of one's actions, or by blaming and dehumanizing the victims. One set of disengagement practices operates on the construal of the behavior itself. People do not ordinarily engage in reprehensible conduct until they have justified to themselves the morality of their actions. What is culpable can be made honorable through cognitive reconstrual. People then act on a moral imperative. The conversion of socialized people into dedicated combatants is not achieved by altering their personality structures, aggressive drives, or moral standards. Rather, it is accomplished by cognitively restructuring the moral value of killings, so that the killing can be done free from self-censoring restraints. Several features of terrorist acts give power to a few incidents to incite widespread public fear that vastly exceeds the objective threat. The first such feature is the unpredictability of terrorist acts. The second feature is the gravity of the consequences. A third feature of terrorist acts that renders them so terrorizing is the sense of uncontrollability that they may instill. The fourth feature is the high centralization and interdependency of essential service systems in modern-day life. Activities can take on a very different appearance depending on what they are called. Euphemistic language thus provides a convenient device for making reprehensible activities or even conferring a respectable status. Whenever events occur or are presented contiguously, the first one colors how the second one is perceived and judged. By exploiting the contrast principle, moral judgments of conduct can be influenced by the expedient structuring of what it is compared against. Self-deplored acts can be made to appear righteous by contrasting them with flagrant inhumanities. Advantageous comparisons are also drawn from history to justify violence. Cognitive restructuring of behavior through moral justifications and palliative characterizations is the most effective psychological mechanisms for promoting destructive conduct. This is because moral restructuring not only eliminates self-deterrence but engages self-approval in the service of destructive exploits. What was once morally condemnable becomes a source of self-valuation. After destructive means become invested with high moral purpose, functionaries work hard to become proficient at them and take pride in their destructive accomplishments. Another set of dissociative practices operates by obscuring or distorting the relationships between actions and the effects they cause. People behave in injurious ways they normally repudiate if a legitimate authority accepts responsibility for the consequences of their conduct. Under conditions of displaced responsibility, people view their actions as springing from the dictates of authorities, rather than from their own volition. Because they are not the actual agents of their actions, they are spared self-prohibiting reactions. The deterrent power of self-sanctions is weakened when responsibility for culpable behavior is diffused, thereby obscuring the link between conduct and its consequences. Responsibility can be diffused in several ways, for example, by the division of labor. Collective actions is still another diffusion expedient for weakening self-restraints. Additional ways of weakening self-deterring reactions operate through disregard for or misrepresentation of the consequences of action. When people choose to pursue activities that are harmful to others for reasons of personal gain or social inducements, they avoid facing or minimize the harm they cause. The final set of disengagement practices operates on the targets of violence acts. The strength of self-censoring reactions to injurious conduct depends partly on how the perpetrator views the people toward whom the harmful is directed. To perceive another person as human enhances empathetic or vicarious reactions through perceived similarity. The joys and suffering of similar persons are more vicariously arousing than are the joys and suffering of strangers or of persons who have been divested of human qualities. Self-sanctions against cruel conduct can be disengaged or blunted by divesting people of human qualities. Imputing blame to one's antagonist is still another expedient that can serve self-exonerative purposes. One's own violent conduct can then be viewed as compelled by forcible provocation. The path to terrorism can be shaped by fortuitous factors as well as by the conjoint influence of personal predilections and social inducements. 13. Beck, A. T. 2002. Prisoners of Hate. Behavior Research and Therapy, 43, 209-216. Call number, key quote summary, authors abstract, the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. on September 11, 2001 as well as domestic terrorism in the United States and elsewhere in the world has prompted an analysis of the psychology of the terrorist. The perpetrator's profound sense of being wronged, their values undermined by foreign powers or a corrupt domestic power structure, has cried out for revolution and revenge. The fanatic ideology of the perpetrators has provided the matrix for a progressively more malevolent representation of the oppressors, the image of the enemy. Retribution against the enemy in the form of mass murder of anonymous civilians becomes an imperative. The counterpart of the image of the enemy is the idealized collective self-image of members of the movement, faction, or cult. The group narcissism of the white supremacists. In the United States, the Aum Shinrikyo in Japan, and the Islamic extremists enhance their collective self-image as pure, righteous, and united. While the foot soldiers, as in any war, gain glory through martyrdom, the instigators and leaders have their own personal narcissistic goals, power and prestige, and plan. For the extremist Islamists, the ultimate goal has been overthrow of the moderate Islamic governments; for the domestic terrorists, destabilization of the national government and reinstitution of the traditional values. What then is the psychology of the terrorist? It is crucial to understand that their ideology concentrates their thinking and controls their actions. Driving violent acts of this type is the perpetrator's view of the victim, the image of the enemy. Islamic radicals who become obsessed with these polarized images are prime candidates for recruitment for assignments of assault on the enemy. They have demonized their antagonists and dehumanized its people. The thinking of the terrorist evidently shows the same kind of cognitive distortions observed in others who engage in violent acts either solely as individuals or as members of a group. These include overgeneralization, that is, the supposed sins of the enemy may spread to encompass the entire population. Also, they show dichotomous thinking: a people are either totally good or totally bad. Finally, they demonstrate tunnel vision once they are engaged in their holy mission, e.g., jihad. Their thinking, and consequently their actions, focuses exclusively on the destruction of the target. The perspective of the psychology of the terrorist needs to be extended to the polarized thinking of the militant fundamentalist groups that are the breeding grounds of the terrorists. The cognitive approach to hot violence that is associated with anger is based on two premises. First, people are people whether they are operating individually or in groups. Secondly, the violently hostile person has strong negative biases toward the victim. The greater the degree of bias and degree of distortion, the stronger the effect. The most widely recognized theory that addresses the roots of all forms of violence is the psychoanalytic model. Despite its influence on writers in the political science, sociology, history, and criminology literature, this model has weak logical, theoretical, and empirical foundations. The enemy that we see, according to Freud, is simply a rejected image of our own inner nature. In contrast to the psychoanalytic model, I propose a generic cognitive model that is more parsimonious and which has been empirically supported in studies of individuals. When we perceive ourselves or our group as threatened, often by a stigmatized minority, our internal representation of ourselves is usually of goodness and that of other people with whom we are in conflict with badness. Over time, our view of the other person or group progresses from opponent to antagonist to enemy. We see the enemy as dangerous, needing to be isolated, punished, or eliminated. The second theme in personal or group violence is the sense of revulsion certain individuals experience when they perceive other individuals or groups as immoral, corrupt, subverting their basic values. A third component in violence is the reaction to the harm that people believe they have sustained. We all know that not everybody who is angered punches an antagonist in the mouth or shoots up a restaurant. No matter how strong, the urge is subject to restraints. These inhibitions operate automatically and effectively unless they are attenuated by the assailant's permissive beliefs or ideology. Group narcissism is accentuated by ideologies and increases the willingness to resort to violence to resolve grievances. 14. Becker, J. 1977. Hitler's Children, The Story of the Baader-Meinhof Terrorist Gang. Philadelphia, J.B. Lippincott. Call number, editor's annotation. This is an early biography of the Baader-Meinhof gang. Although there is discussion of the individuals involved, and this was written before some of the key players killed themselves in prison, the focus is on the ideology, implicitly, and actions, explicitly, of the collective group. It is one of the most comprehensive and well-researched English biographical works on the organization, and Becker does not portray herself as an apologist of any kind for the group or its tactics. Beyond the essence of insights gained from a review of one's personal history, however, there is little in the ways of psychological analysis or elucidation of principles. 15. Bell, J. B. 1982. Psychology of Leaders of Terrorist Groups. International Journal of Group Tensions, 12, 84-104. Call number, editor's annotation. This is a transcript of a conference session from the International Organization for the Study of Group Tensions, 1981. The speaker is supposed to provide an overview on psychology of leaders of terrorist groups. Although he reportedly spent his career talking to terrorists and fanatics, but begins with the premise that nobody knows what a terrorist is, much less a terrorist leader. States that the organizational chart of most revolutionary organizations looks like a Jackson Pollock painting. Provides some anecdotes about people who hold power and influence in their organizations. They have very deep and very narrow political beliefs, have tunnel vision that armed struggle is only option. Some discussion with other attendees. Despite a promising title, this article offers very little substantive information on the topic. 16. Benjamin, J. 2002. Terror and Guilt, Beyond Them and Us. Psychoanalytic Dialogues, 12, 3, 473-484. Call number, editor's annotation. Personal reflection of an NYC psychoanalyst on guilt experienced in the wake of 9/11 and subsequent U.S. actions. Recommends moving relations with people from other countries away from U.S. them orientation to we orientation. 17. Benson, M. Evans, M. and Simon, R. 1982. Women as Political Terrorists. Research in Law, Deviance, and Social Control, 4, 121-130. Call number, key quote summary. This paper examines the roles women perform as terrorist and political criminals, using as much data as we could locate from a variety of countries and historical periods. If the women's liberation movement has brought about an increase in the participation of women in radical and terrorist groups, then one would expect that prior to the women's liberation movement the role of women in radical political protests would be much less noticeable. Historical evidence, however, does not support this conjecture. Not only is the active participation of women in revolutionary movements commonplace, women in revolutionary movements have not limited their participation to supportive, housekeeping roles. During the reign of Alexander II, women were founders and leaders of many revolutionary groups and were regarded by some men as the driving force of the revolution. Consider, for example, the leadership role played by Alexandra Kollontai in the Bolshevik Revolution. Historically, women have also been active in revolutionary movements in Latin America. Jaquette claims that female revolutionaries can be traced back at least as far as Cecilia Tupac Amaro, who in 1780 led an Indian revolt against the Spanish. A study conducted by the U.S. Department of the Army of Insurgent Movements in the Far East reported that about one-third of all guerrillas captured in Korea in 1951 were women. 5 to 15% of the Min-Yun, the underground army of insurgent movement, in Malaya were women. According to McClure, women constitute one-fifth to one-third of the participants in terrorist organizations in Germany and Japan. What kinds of women become terrorists? Biographies, diaries and police reports reveal that they are typically well-educated and are drawn from the middle or upper classes. The average Japanese is just under 30. We see that age distribution of women is more uniform than that of men, which is highly concentrated in the ages of 18 to 40. Why are there proportionally more girls, 26%, than boys, 5%? Under the age of 17? Why are there proportionally more women, 24%, than men, 14%, over the of 40? One might make a plausible argument that young girls are socially invisible and hence make choice recruits for insurgent movements. The greater proportion of women over age of 40 shows that once a woman joins a revolutionary group, she stays. Alternatively, it may be that male guerrillas are more likely than their female counterparts to experience combat. There is a good deal of disagreement about whether the division of labor by gender is traditional or egalitarian in terrorist groups. Jaquette, for example, notes that female revolutionaries are often wives or lovers of male revolutionaries. Contemporary terrorist groups can be divided into two categories, idealists and nationalists. In idealists groups, there seems to be little, if any, division of labor by sex. By contrast, nationalist terrorist and revolutionary groups such as the IRA and FLN are more stable and have drawn more people to their causes. Fanon's study of the Algerian Revolution demonstrates how women's roles in revolutionary groups may change as the position of the group vis-a-vis its enemies changes. It also illustrates our contention that revolutionary theory and practice can lead to a breakdown in traditional female roles, rather than a breakdown in roles leading to terrorist activity. Accounts of women's and men's activities in the FLN and the IRA suggest that nationalist movements tend to have a more rigid division of labor between men and women than do idealist revolutionary movements. In nationalist movements, women are more likely to act as couriers, spies, and occasionally saboteurs. In sum, the evidence that we have marshaled suggests that women's terrorist activities are not a side effect of the women's liberation movement. More substantial evidence suggests that the division of labor by sex tends to be fairly rigid in nationalistic movements but very flexible, or even non-existent, in idealistic terrorist movements. 18. Billig, O. 1985. The Lawyer Terrorist and His Comrades. Political Psychology, 6, 29-46. Call number, key quote summary, authors abstract. Horst Mahler, a young lawyer who had fled to West Berlin, was the co-founder of the Red Army faction. While imprisoned for committing acts of terror, he and other leading terrorists directed raids and kidnappings against the system. His published interviews and cell circulars provide important insights into the multi-causal factors in the making of a terrorist. 1. Apprehensions over the profound progress of scientific and technological progress exploited by the capitalist system. 2. Blame directed toward the father's generation for the horrors of the Hitler system and complicity with the expansionistic United States. 3. Inability to identify with an adequate father figure which led to anti-authoritarian stance and overcompensation when the terrorists exercised their own ruthless authority. Enclosure in the underground reinforced hostility. The psychological mechanisms caused by withdrawal from society-fostered commission of dehumanized acts. Modern German terrorism had its beginnings in 1968 when 2 department stores in Frankfurt were set ablaze. One of the arsonists, Andreas Bader, was defended by Horst Mahler, a young lawyer who gained respect among young radicals for having sued a German university that had discriminated against a student for political reasons. Mahler carried the case to the European Commission on Human Rights and won. Not satisfied with fighting legal battles in court, Mahler had been an active participant in street demonstrations in Germany during the middle of the 1960s and a few years later became one of the founders of Germany's most notorious terrorist group, the Red Army faction. His radical political views may have been rooted as much in his personal life as in the tempestuous political scene in Berlin during the 1960s. Mahler's father, a dentist in Hitler's Germany, was a committed Nazi Party member. He was arrested for participating in acts of damaging property. Deprived of his professional standing, Mahler became even more deeply involved in serious violations of the law. He turned toward the ultimate authoritarianism that he detested in others, when he began to take a leading role in the riotous political world of the late 1960s. In May of 1970, Mahler conspired with Ulrike Meinhof to free Andreas Bader. Mahler escaped to Jordan with some of his companions, using forged passports. There they took guerrilla training in PLO camp. The 2-month training period was physically hard for the European intellectuals. With their knowledge of guerrilla tactics, Mahler and Meinhof joined together to fight what they perceived to be the authoritarian abuses of the German state. Under the leadership of Mahler and Meinhof, the Red Army faction planned attacks on army installations to steal weapons. Since the fledgling organization needed money to finance its terrorist activities, Mahler masterminded 3 bank robberies which were synchronized to take place within 10 minutes of one another on the morning of September 29, 1970. All 3 were successful, but Horst was betrayed by a trusted friend. Mahler's short career as an active terrorist was over. He continued to work as a theoretician for the RAF while in prison, but not for long. Other members of the RAF cadre who have been arrested and sent to prison did not welcome the lawyer's plan for riot. Unlike Meinhof, who had become one of Mahler's most severe critics, considered the plan to be a selfish fit of rage. When the protests against isolation proved unsuccessful, the terrorists agreed collectively to use hunger strikes as a final weapon of the comrades who are in the clink. After 2 years in prison, Mahler changed his position from that of the other terrorist. He condemned the hunger strikes as unwise attempts to achieve preferential treatment which would only deepen the split between the terrorists and the normals. Mahler became increasingly irritated with the various protests of the RAF underground against the prison regulation. He seemed to have been referring to the suicides of the Stammheim defendants. Serious disagreements had begun to develop among the terrorists about their basic strategy. The German magazine Der Spiegel arranged a discussion between Horst Mahler, the terrorist, and Gerhard Baum, the German Minister of the Interior, while Mahler was still in prison, Jeschke, 1980. Baum questioned how he, a minister, and Mahler, the lawyer terrorist, both engaged in active political lives, both of similar age, both from substantial middle-class backgrounds. Both having spent their boyhoods during the time of National Socialism, could have followed such divergent roads. Mahler held the immorality of the Nazi regime responsible for his acts, while the minister was of the opinion that other factors played a role in causing acts of terrorism. According to Mahler's reasoning, the state was accountable for provoking the wrath of the extremists. The state became the absolute enemy, the world's evil, guilty of daily unending suffering, murder and manslaughter, Jeschke, 1980. Mahler gave various reasons to justify the war of destruction between the state and its people. It occurred because those in power refused to listen to the truth. The former lawyer found the capitalistic system guilty of destroying civilization by abusing modern technology and science. Although most of the imprisoned terrorists objected to being isolated from their comrades and refused to have contacts with normal prisoners, Mahler found such associations helpful. His disputes with them moderated his commitment to the terrorist cause and liberated his thinking. He began to oppose terrorist attacks and switched to the Maoist communist camp. Mahler was excommunicated from the RAF, which he had founded only a few years earlier. The original goal of RAF had been to start a socialist revolution to fight humiliation of Germany's past and the country's entanglement with the USA. After the jailing of members of the Bader-Meinhof group, the emphasis shifted to freeing prisoners. The German terrorist movement appears to be a multi-casual phenomenon. Horst Mahler, the founder of the RAF, provides valuable insights into the making of a terrorist. Horst's turning away from the extreme right was not only due to the Nazi regime's defeat but probably motivated by his objections to his father's ideologies. The terrorists became dependent on each other for support and considered the outside world an evil system to be eliminated. 19. Birrell, D. 1972. Relative deprivation as a factor in conflict in Northern Ireland. Sociopolitical Review, 20, 317-343. Call number, editor's annotation. The author uses the concept of relative deprivation, a group sees itself at a disadvantage when it is compared to some other reference groups, to explain conflicts between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. It argues that Catholics historically have perceived themselves to be at a disadvantage and that this perception is supported by objective data. Runikman's 3 areas of inequality are used: economic, social, and political. Author suggests relative deprivation can lead to violence in at least 2 ways: 1, via frustration aggression, GER, or 2, via creative rioting, Gestwender, rioting accompanied by stated political demands and attempts to occupy or control an area. The author's conclusion is that relative deprivation is a causal factor on Northern Ireland violence, and because the inequality is real, the only reasonable remedy to violence is correcting the lack or equality. 20. Jorgo, T. 1997. Racist and right-wing violence in Scandinavia, patterns, perpetrators, and responses. Also Tano Astos Fontenezeri. Call number, editor's annotation. This book began as the author's dissertation. It focuses on the diversity in racist and right-wing violence in Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, with an emphasis on violence toward immigrants. Although some anti-immigrant violence is committed by racist gangs, much of it is done by young gangs that subscribe to no collective ideology. The author describes Helmut Willem's classification of perpetrators of racial violence: ideological activists, xenophobes, criminals, and fellow travelers. He classifies the groups themselves as either national Democrats, anti-immigration activists, or racial revolutionaries, neo-Nazis. The text provides data on trends of the relevant offenses in each country. Sweden tends to have more xenophobic violence. Group dynamics factor significantly into these attacks, and the waves and patterns cannot be completely explained by macrosocial factors. Younger gang members, adolescents, seem drawn to racist gangs and their anti-immigrant activity just to be part of a group. Young adult gangs, 17 to 25, tend to be economically deprived and blame immigrants for their plight. What will facilitate violence with the group is prior familiarity with vandalism and violence, access to weapons, and proximity to hated targets. At the community level, law enforcement neglect, media publicity, and a tacit anti-immigrant community sentiment also tend to breed such incidents. The revolutionary groups are driven by the notion of war against the Zionist-occupied government and frenzied by white power music. In general, in racist groups, racism tends to the result rather than the cause of group affiliation. The more individuals become included and socialized within the group, and insulated from extra-group influences, the more difficult it becomes to leave. The author discusses the differing dynamics in Scandinavian groups adhering to anti-Muslim versus anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. He concludes with a lucid and insightful summary of the core values areas over which racist groups, communities, the media, etc. all vie for control: ideology and immigration politics, identity, scarce resources, sexuality, territory, and security. An excellent work on the phenomenon of racist violence, with insights that extend well beyond the Scandinavian experience. 21. Jorgo, T. 1995. Terror from the Extreme Right. London, Frank and Cass. Call number, editor's annotation. This book began as the author's dissertation. It focuses on the diversity in racist and right-wing violence in Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, with an emphasis on violence toward immigrants. Although some anti-immigrant violence is committed by racist gangs, much of it is done by young gangs that subscribe to no collective ideology. The author describes Helmut Willem's classification of perpetrators of racial violence: ideological activists, xenophobes, criminals, and fellow travelers. He classifies the groups themselves as either national Democrats, anti-immigration activists, or racial revolutionaries, neo-Nazis. The text provides data on trends of the relevant offenses in each country. Sweden tends to have more xenophobic violence. Group dynamics factor significantly into these attacks, and the waves and patterns cannot be completely explained by macrosocial factors. Younger gang members, adolescents, seem drawn to racist gangs and their anti-immigrant activity just to be part of a group. Young adult gangs, 17 to 25, tend to be economically deprived and blame immigrants for their plight. What will facilitate violence with the group is prior familiarity with vandalism and violence, access to weapons, and proximity to hated targets. At the community level, law enforcement neglect, media publicity, and a tacit anti-immigrant community sentiment also tend to breed such incidents. The revolutionary groups are driven by the notion of war against the Zionist-occupied government and frenzied by white power music. In general, in racist groups, racism tends to the result rather than the cause of group affiliation. The more individuals become included and socialized within the group, and insulated from extra-group influences, the more difficult it becomes to leave. The author discusses the differing dynamics in Scandinavian groups adhering to anti-Muslim versus anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. He concludes with a lucid and insightful summary of the core values areas over which racist groups, communities, the media, etc. all vie for control: ideology and immigration politics, identity, scarce resources, sexuality, territory, and security. An excellent work on the phenomenon of racist violence, with insights that extend well beyond the Scandinavian experience. 22. Bollinger, L. 1985. Terrorist conduct as a result of a psychological process. Psychiatry, The State of the Art, Volume 6 pp. 387 to 390. New York, Plenum. Call number, editor's annotation. This article presents a psychodynamic/psychosocial model that essentially represents a pathway into and through terrorists' groups. The three main phases are disposition originating in the family, primary deviance in the family system, and chances for integration into increasingly deviant groups and subcultures. Ultimately, the purpose of terrorism becomes perpetuation of the group. Author acknowledges prospective application versus not practical. No real operational implications. 23. Borum, R. 2003. Understanding the Terrorist Mindset. FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin, 72, 7, 7. Call number, key quote summary. There likely is no universal method in developing extremist ideas that justifies terroristic acts of violence. However, four observable stages appear to frame a process of ideological development common to many individuals and groups of diverse ideological backgrounds. This four-stage process is a model designed as a heuristic, trial and error, to aid investigators and intelligence analysts in assessing the behaviors, experiences, and activities of a group or individual associated with extremist ideas. Begins by framing some unsatisfying event or condition as being unjust, blaming the injustice on a target policy, person, or nation, and then vilifying, often demonizing, the responsible party to facilitate justification for aggression. To begin with, an extremist individual or group identifies some type of undesirable event or condition. It's not right. While the nature of the condition may vary, those involved perceive the experience as things are not as they should be. That is, it's not right. Next, they frame the undesirable condition as an injustice, that is, it does not apply to everyone, it's not fair. Then, because injustice generally results from transgressive, wrongful behavior, extremists hold a person or group responsible. It's your fault, identifying a potential target. Last, they deem the person or group responsible for the injustice as bad, you're evil. After all, good people would not intentionally inflict adverse conditions on others. This ascription has three effects that help facilitate violence. First, aggression becomes more justifiable when aimed against bad people, particularly those who intentionally cause harm to others. Second, extremists describe the responsible party as evil. Dehumanizing a target in this regard further facilitates aggression. Third, those suffering adverse conditions at the hands of others do not see themselves as bad or evil. This further identifies the responsible person or group as different from those affected and, thus, makes justifying aggression even easier. Also, it is important to understand that analyzing counter-terrorist intelligence requires an understanding of behavior, not just ideology. Investigators and analysts who attempt to understand and anticipate how a person will act in a given situation should seek to understand that individual's map, or perception, of the situation. Ideology may be a part of that, but other important dynamics and behavioral factors may contribute as well. 24. Bourne, L. E. Healy, A. F. and Beer, F. A. 2003. Military Conflict and Terrorism, General Psychology Informs International Relations. Review of General Psychology, 7, 2, 189-202. Call number, editor's annotation, empirical study of college students' hypothetical responses to aggression from another nation-state. Examined personality styles in addition to experimental condition persons higher in dominance almost always advocated for more aggressive retaliation than those who were more submissive. A similar but less robust or reliable trend was found for greater aggression in more conservative students than those that were more liberal. Anticipated reactions were similar for military and terrorist attacks. Men and women showed similar levels of conflict in their reactions, unless a peace treaty was in place, in which women were more forgiving and men more aggressive. Responses escalated in level of conflict after repeated attacks. Very little discussion of methods. Very little generalizability, given college student sample. Does not contribute to understanding terrorist behavior. Strength of personality variables in predictory response is interesting. 25. Boyer-Bell, J. 1998. The Dynamics of the Armed Struggle. London, Frank Cass and Company. Call number, editor's annotation. The Dynamics of the Armed Struggle is an authoritative and provocative analysis of the nature of one of the time's most prevalent forms of political violence. Dr. Boyer-Bell has attended wars, not seminars, in pursuit of data, insight and explanation, and has been shot at, kidnapped, expelled and questioned from Central America to Northern Ireland, a scholar amid terror. The text arises from his access to the underground, from time spent in the revolutionary ecosystem and among those who kill to make a dream real. The result is a unique analysis that transcends traditional studies of insurgency or terrorism, depicting a strange world where the will is trusted, not tangible assets, where a galaxy of the faithful seeks to alter history. Sometimes the will prevails over the assets of the state, the weak win because their will endures until the center fails. The structure that the faithful create, everywhere different yet everywhere the same, has not been examined before from the inside out. The Dynamics of the Armed Struggle is both a special and a general study of the hidden world of the gunman, not as a mirror image of everyday reality amenable to academic tools, but as perceived by a scholar with a visa into violence. The reader will no longer find the armed struggles of our time inexplicable, merely horrible, yet emerging as cohesive means to act on events. This book offers a compelling insight into an elusive phenomenon, a process that at times allows the few to change the course of history. 26. Brackett, D.W. 1996. Holy Terror, Armageddon in Tokyo. New York, Weatherhill. Call number, editor's annotation. This book provides a fairly detailed account of the evolution of the Aum Shinrikyo from Buddhist sect to cult and ultimately to apocalyptic terrorist group. It covers the plan and execution of the now famous sarin nerve gas attack on the Tokyo subway, but also details other atrocities committed by Aum members both within the group, e.g., purification rituals by scalding and murder of group members, and toward adversaries of the group, e.g., brutal murder of a lawyer and his family. The author acknowledges limitations in his ability to discern the truth due to often conflicting accounts and ongoing investigations that changed the official accounts. Although Aum's motives were somewhat peculiar, for those concerned with the prospect of terrorists using WMDs, this account can be seen as a case study in acquiring materials, including uranium in Australia, and technology, including collaboration with former Soviet scientists, and planning for their use in an attack, all from the base of a relatively secure country with a stable government. The general lessons, to the extent that there are any, are not clearly elucidated, but that was not the main objective of the book, which was simply to tell the story. 27. Brannan, D. W. Esseler, P. F. and Strindberg, N. T. A. 2001. Talking to Terrorists, Towards an Independent Analytical Framework for the Study of Violent Substate Activism. Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, 24, 1, 3-24. Call number, key quote summary, author's abstract. Terrorism studies as a specific discipline is a comparatively recent addition to the social sciences and is still grappling with questions relating to a proper or appropriate methodology. This article argues that research within the field is often based neither on primary sources nor set within an independent analytical framework. Rather, it is characterized by an aligned position dependent on a research hermeneutic of crisis management, which perpetuates the received view. Talking to Terrorists and the use of social identity theory, applied in a context of cultural difference, are here proposed as a methodology enabling independent analysis. Substate activist groups engaging in, or threatening violence in order to further their goals operate across the globe. Between them, these groups represent a wide range of political ideologies, religious beliefs, and other intellectually, spiritually, or emotionally propelled agendas. They may be numerically large or small, and may enjoy popular support or be the subjects of widespread loathing. The groups and their members exhibit various degrees of volatility and stability. Operating in different geographic, political, and cultural environments, they adopt different modi operandi and rules of engagement. Their lowest common denominator, a politically geared challenge to, and defiance of the nation-state's monopoly on armed violence and coercion, has nevertheless caused this disparate collection of groups to be lumped together under the unified heading terrorists. Terrorism studies emerged as a subcategory within the social sciences in the early 1970s, seeking to explain their surgence of the seemingly inexplicable. It has remained one of the main forums for the study of political and religious sub-state activism since. Scholars within the field have sought to understand what terrorism is. The present article addresses what it sees as some of the more serious theoretical deficiencies within terrorism studies and explores potential avenues for improvement. This article argues that the theoretical deficiency within the terrorism studies community is merely a symptom of a more serious intellectual predicament. The present authors have termed the hermeneutic of crisis management. By this is meant an attitudinal predisposition and framework of analysis prevalent within the terrorism studies community that has the researcher approaching her or his research subject antagonistically, as a threat, with a view to facilitate its defeat. The close collaboration of the terrorism studies community with the Western counterterrorism agencies is mirrored by a profound reluctance to engage in dialogue with the terrorists. This article proposes that what is needed is their placement of the crisis management hermeneutic, the metastructure within which theoretical models are applied with a more constructive framework that adequately accounts for the dynamics of group identity and belonging within a framework of profound cultural difference. This framework, it is argued, is found in social identity theory, a heuristic model of the way human identity develops in groups that take seriously the critical issues of culture and social environment. As a non-reductionist theory of group behavior, social identity theory emphasizes the significance of the subject's social situation, the group member's internally constructed social identity, and the context in which a cohesive group consciousness is installed in the minds and hearts of the members. The first section of this article offers a review of terrorism studies literature. The second section raises the issue of the hermeneutic of crisis management and two specific concerns emanating from it. The third section contains a framework for intergroup communication as developed in other academic fields of study. Terrorism literature took off in the same year as international terrorism itself, 1968, and the accumulated output is by now vast. A focused survey of the scholarly output during 3 decades of terrorism studies indicates that the theoretical inadequacies are long-standing and the hermeneutic of crisis management is deeply entrenched. Theorizing about terrorism has always been problematic as a consequence of the diverse nature of the groups and individuals that are categorized as terrorist. Models based on psychological concerns typically hold that terrorist violence is not so much a political instrument as an end in itself. It is not contingent on rational agency but is the result of compulsion or psychopathology. Over the years, scholars of this persuasion have suggested that terrorists do what they do because of, variously and among other things, self-destructive urges, fantasies of cleanliness, disturbed emotions combined with problems with authority and the self, and inconsistent mothering. According to another prolific interpretative model, terrorism is based on power-oriented instrumentalism, or strategic choice theory. If it seeks to attribute a certain set of abnormalities to the terrorist mind, it lacks empirical evidence, and one must concur with Konrad Kellen in concluding that such interpretations of terrorism may or may not be accurate, in particular cases, but lack general applicability. Terrorism studies has remained profoundly distant from its research subject. The lack of interaction with actual terrorists is evidenced by the literature, and not talking to terrorists seems to have become established as a source of scholarly credibility. Instead, the field has increasingly come to rely on secondary sources. How is it possible to make psychoanalytical pronouncements about individuals one has never had contact with? Schmidt and Jungmann lucidly but damningly sum up the early years of terrorism research in a 1988 stock-taking of the field. There are probably few areas in the social science literature in which so much is written on the basis of so little research. Perhaps as much as 80% of the literature is not research-based in any rigorous sense. Two recent works that understand the importance of primary encounters and make use of them are Jessica Stern's The Ultimate Terrorists and Jonathan Tucker's edition, Toxic Terror. From within its own intellectual metastructure, the terrorism studies community has created a profoundly adversarial relationship with its research subject. This seems to stem partly from the notion that scholars are obliged to defend liberal democratic society and, thus, to combat terrorism. As each scholar or institution makes their definitional bid, what they are offering is nothing more than a formal statement on who, in their opinion, should be thought of as a terrorist. The debate has gone nowhere precisely because defining terrorism is an exercise in political classification. When the rationale of the research becomes understanding the threat rather than understanding a social phenomenon, this influences the manner in which the subject is approached, affects the results of the research, and thus impinges upon the scope of understanding and knowledge. Related to the adversarial relationship with their search subject and the close relationship with government agencies, is the bias developed through reliance on secondary source material even where primary sources are available. There is one fundamental issue relevant to such understanding that is rarely mentioned in terrorism studies and yet the virtual absence of which is an unambiguous sign of the flawed methodology currently in vogue. At the most general level, culture refers to the totality of the impact that human beings make upon the natural environment. In this context, however, we are interested in the immaterial or social dimensions of culture, that is, the unique collection of social roles, institutions, values, ideas, and symbols operative in every group, which radically conditions the way in which its members see the world and respond to its challenge. In every human culture there are sets of behaviors, often quite specific to that culture, that are fairly predictable and regular and that are capable of being presented in generalized and typical patterns, even though the unpredictability endemic to human affairs means that they do not acquire the status of social law. In recent years there has been a great deal of research done to develop a taxonomy of national Cultures. Most useful for our purposes is the line of investigation begun in 1980 by Dutch social scientist Geert Hofstede in his book Culture's Consequences. In it, Hofstede analyzed 100,000 questionnaires by the employees of a particular multinational in 50 countries around the world. On the basis of his results, he was able to isolate a set of 5 variables used for characterizing national cultures. These were 1. The respective significance of the individual and the group wink with a frown. 2. The differences in social roles between men and women. 3. The manner of dealing with inequality wink with a frown. 4. The degree of tolerance for the unknown. And 5. The trade-off between long and short-term gratification of needs. Subsequent work has shown that the most important of Hofstede's variables was his allocation of every culture to some point on a continuum from pronounced individualism at one end to strong group orientation at the other, a continuum that does not preclude exceptions to the basic pattern. By individualism, which is quite distinct from individuality, Hofstede means the social condition where ties between individuals are weak as opposed to group orientation, and where from birth onwards people are integrated into strong, cohesive groups that provide protection in exchange for loyalty. Individualist cultures, like those of the US and the UK, emphasize interpersonal competition, individual achievement, enterprise and innovativeness, and easy separation from kin and other groups, while collective ones prefer collective achievements, close ties within group members, and a disinclination to innovate or diverge from established ways. With group orientation being far more common. Mediterranean culture that focuses on its group-oriented nature as one of an ensemble of related cultural features. Other prominent features of Mediterranean culture include the status of honor as the pivotal social value, with its rough opposite being shame, the notion that goods, including honor, exist only infinite quantities, so that a person can only gain more of them at the expense of someone else, the importance of patron and client relations, and the role of purity codes in social interactions. Early researchers in this area included J.G. Parishcheny, Julian Pitt Rivers, J.K. Campbell, and Pierre Bourdieu. None of this is to deny that we are here talking about culture at a fairly high level of generality, which allows for exceptions and local variations as we move in to examine data closely. Our basic submission is that when interacting with group-oriented persons such as those from the Middle East, and all others that perceive of themselves as substantially defined by belonging to a group, an issue returned to later, anyone socialized in an individualistic North Atlantic culture must assume that a very conscious and deliberate effort will be necessary to avoid misunderstanding and gross cultural blunders. The preceding discussion on culture concerns the primary level of socialization, which we would expect to impact upon all the individuals and groups originating in particular cultural settings. Accordingly, it is reasonable to assume that some more focused type of theory might be helpful for investigating how groups relate to one another either within a similar culture or, indeed, across different cultures. In other words, some framework, embedded in the context of cultural difference articulated above, that fixes upon the specific dynamics of group processes might assist in the analysis of sub-state activist groups. We have chosen social identity theory for this purpose. Social identity theory represents a branch of social psychology largely developed by Henri Tajfel and his colleagues and students at Bristol University in England in the 1970s and 1980s. Social identity theory adopts a distinctive position in relation to the continuing problem of the relationship between the individual and the group. The central idea of social identity theory, on the other hand, is that being categorized as members of certain groups provides an important part of the self-concept of individuals. To an extent, we learn who we are from the groups to which we belong. It follows that any prestige or value associated with those groups will have implications for our feelings of self-worth. The extent to which group membership contributes to a sense of self varies depending upon the level of group orientation present in the ambient culture. Nevertheless, in describing the experience of belonging to a group, it is helpful to follow Tajfel in differentiating 3 components. 1. A cognitive component, i.e., in the sense of the knowledge that one belongs to a group. 2. An evaluative component, in the sense that the notion of the group or one's membership in it may have a positive or negative connotation. And 3. An emotional component, in the sense that the cognitive and evaluative aspects of the group and one's membership in it may be accompanied by emotions, such as love, hate, etc., directed towards one's own group and towards others that stand in certain relationships to it. Tajfel defines social identity to mean that part of an individual's self-concept that derives from his or her knowledge of membership of a social group, or groups, together with the value and emotional significance attached to that membership. Within the context of social identity theory, stereotypes are reconceived as generalizations about people based on category membership. Social identity theory itself is developing a sophisticated battery of ideas for resolving intergroup conflict. 3 prominent areas, among many, are crossed categorizations, using one social category to cancel out another, recategorization, bringing members of 2 categories together under an inclusive, superordinate one, and decategorization, dissolving the problematic categories altogether, especially by facilitating contact between members of rival groups. 28. Brockner, J., and Rubin, J. K. 1985. Entrapment in Escalating Conflicts, A Social Psychological Analysis. New York, Springer Verlag. Call number, editor's annotation. This book is a technical treatise on how and why people continue to move forward on a decision they think is stupid or at least doomed to a bad outcome. The social psychological term for being stuck is entrapment. The authors use the following formal definition of entrapment: a decision-making process whereby individuals escalate their commitment to a previously chosen, though failing, course of action in order to justify or make good on prior investments. Most of the book focuses on pure, experimental social psychological research, which has very little relevance to counterterrorism operations. In fact, there is no discussion of terrorism, per se, anywhere in the book. Although this text thoroughly analyzes the research on social and non-social factors that affect entrapment, it is highly questionable whether these results would translate into any meaningful understanding of terrorist groups. It is interesting to note, though, that they found no compelling or even promising evidence for entrapment-prone personality. Perhaps of some interest are the findings in Chapter 7 describing psychological effects of entrapment, including the way in which it can alter motivations and lead to a lack of attention to any outside or peripheral factors. Chapters 9 and 10 ostensibly discuss some implications, but the applied value for counterterrorism is rather limited. In essence, the research would suggest that if one thinks ahead about what could happen as a result of a decision and what the downsides or costs may be, this may build some resistance to entrapment. 29. Bruin de Dunajevich, J., and Puget, J., 1989. State Terrorism and Psychoanalysis. International Journal of Mental Health, 18, 2, 98-112. Call number, editor's annotation. Between 1976 and 1983, state terrorism produced a type of violence in Argentina with specific characteristic types that contained within it death, sophisticated cruelty, and terror. Focuses on the victimization of victims of this oppressive state of violence. Describes tactics of repression used by the regime. A methodology of repression, disappearance, employed as a method of ideological repression, involving kidnapping, clandestine detention, and later murder of adults, adolescents, and children of a specific social-cultural and ideological background, who may or may not have been political militants. 30. Bruce, S., 1990. Protestant Resurgence and Fundamentalism. Political Quarterly, 61, 161-168. Call number, editor's annotation. In this brief essay, I will describe three movements which are sometimes called fundamentalist, Pentecostalism in Latin America and other parts of the Third World, the New Christian Right in American, and Paisleyism in Northern Ireland. After a brief account of each, I will offer some general and comparative observations about fundamentalism. There are undoubtedly political causes and consequences of the spread of Pentecostalism. Rather than seeing the spread of Pentecostalism as a sinister right-wing plot, one should appreciate the parallels between the social and psychological roles of Methodism in urban England in the second half of the 18th century. To take a positive side of appeal of Pentecostalism, it offers to those people who are, as David Martin put it, outside the downward thrust of elite power and free from the lateral ties of the organic community, a new character. There is no obvious political consequences of the spread of Pentecostalism. By and large, Pentecostalists are politically quiet. The Christian Right, NCR, was a movement of cultural defense. The early part of this century has seen the major Protestant denominations fragment, with minorities rejecting the new liberal interpretations of the Bible, ecumenism, and the socially and ethically progressive spirit which informed the denominational mainstream. American fundamentalists were permitted considerable autonomy, or, to put it another way, ignored, until the 50s and 60s when liberal elites decided that race relations in the country had to be restructured. The NCR was able to generate a great deal of media attention. Money was raised to campaign for and against policy issues and for and against candidates. Although the explanation for the failure of the NCR is complex, we can short-circuit it by noting that most Americans, and that included many fundamentalists, are relatively happy with the present separation of church and state and the maintenance of a tolerant pluralistic religious culture. Ulster, the response to ethnic conflict. Reverend Ian Paisley, whose 3 European Community Parliament election results show him to be easily the most popular politician in Northern Ireland, and his Democratic Unionist Party. In the late 50s, Ian Paisley led Irish Presbyterian dissidents, concerned about the ecumenical or Rome Ward trend in their church, into a schismatic Free Presbyterian church. It might be that Paisley is widely supported despite his religion, simply because he can be trusted not to sell out. The solution to the apparent paradox of secular Protestant support for evangelical rhetoric can be found in the part played by evangelical Protestantism in forging and sustaining the shared identity of the people who settled the northeast of Ireland and their descendants. I am suggesting that, for Ulster Protestants, the conflict is a religious conflict, not because it is about religious or even socio-moral issues, as it is in America, but because their religion is the core of their shared identity. What is fundamentalism? The three movements briefly described have a number of features in common. The first is that they take religion seriously. Not being relativists, they suppose that there is truth and error and that it is important to get it right. What is slight misleading is another hypothetical element of generic fundamentalism, the claim that fundamentalism is always reactive or reactionary. 31. Bruce, S., 1997. Victim Selection in Ethnic Conflict, Motives and Attitudes in Irish Republicanism. Terrorism and Political Violence, 9, 2, 56-71. Call number, editor's annotation, author's abstract. Through examination of statements made by Irish Republicans involved in the Northern Ireland conflict and of the social identities of victims of Republican violence, White has argued that the Irish Republican Army is not sectarian but that the loyalist paramilitaries are. This response challenges both the interpretation of Republican rhetoric and the conclusions drawn from the study of victim selection. Taken narrowly, it is perfectly correct that in contrast to loyalist paramilitaries, Republicans have concentrated on killing members of the security forces. However, the way in which the issue is framed in parts of White's text are potentially extremely misleading. Republican violence is directed against a regime, loyalist violence is directed against a community. Furthermore, this difference in targeting reflects a significant difference in motive. Republicans are not sectarian, in the sense that they do not kill Ulster Protestants because they are Protestants. For reasons I have given at length elsewhere, we cannot, as a matter of principle, disregard the accounts of their motives that actors themselves give, but equally well, we cannot take them at face value, especially when their interests in presenting something other than deep and honest self-critical reflection are so great and so obvious. The important differences start to emerge when we move from reading the data to making inferences about the motives and attitudes that underlie the pattern of killing. A number of observations follow. First, the nature of loyalist violence means that incompetence inflates innocent civilian targets. My argument is as follows. Motive cannot be taken in isolation from opportunity. Before we can infer back from events to intentions, we need to consider the opportunities that were available to act on intentions. The pro-state terrorist has a very difficult job finding his legitimate targets. IRA men very rarely wear uniform, do not travel in marked cars, do not mount stationary road patrols, do not have to operate offices where they can be found by the general public, and do not have a duty to respond to request for assistance from the public. What I meant by target size was twofold. First, and this refers to the availability of the most obviously legitimate targets, there have always been far more British soldiers than Republican activists. Second, the very large number of groups defined as legitimate targets because they are in some sense close to members of the security forces means that there are a very larger number of legitimate targets for the anti-state terror group. My greatest objection to the form of White's argument is that his article rests on the distinction between the IRA killing soldiers and the UDA and UVF killing civilians. The latter is sectarian, the former is not. In the conclusion to his analysis of the murder statistics, White says, the results suggest that the IRA is at war with the British and their security forces in Northern Ireland. Here White is using British in a narrow sense and is wrong. Had he used it in the wider sense to include what Gerry Adams calls pro-British elements, that is, almost the entire Ulster Protestant population, he would have been right. I have no quarrel with White when he notes that the IRA differs from the loyalist paramilitaries in that the largest part of its victims have been members of the security forces while the largest part of the victims of loyalist terror have been helpless civilians. 32. Brunette, L. and Cassoni, D. 1991. Terrorism, Attack on Internal Objects. Melanie Klein and Object Relations, 9, 1, 1-15. Call number, key quote summary, author's abstract. His paper is a theoretical essay concerning the intrapsychic phenomena provoked by the knowledge of acts of terrorism. Through projective and introjective identifications, the spectator of such acts feels compelled to rearrange the dynamics of his internal objects and may resort to primitive defense mechanisms to face the important anxieties which are thus aroused. This paper suggests the hypothesis that terrorists themselves experience similar intrapsychic phenomena. The basis of this essay is the psychoanalytic metapsychology developed by Melanie Klein and her successors, especially in regard to the concepts of unconscious fantasy, internal world, and schizoparanoid and depressive positions. 33. Byman, D. 1998. The Logic of Ethnic Terrorism. Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, 21, 2, 149-169. Call number, key quote summary, author's abstract. Ethnic terrorism differs considerably from violence carried out for ideological, religious, or financial motives. Ethnic terrorists often seek to influence their own constituencies more than the country as a whole. Ethnic terrorists frequently seek to foster communal identity, in contrast to an identity proposed by the state. Ethnic terrorists often target potential intermediaries, who might otherwise compromise on identity issues. A secondary goal of the attacks is to create a climate of fear among the rival group's population. Ethnic terrorism creates a difficult problem for the state. Conventional countermeasures may engender broader support for an insurgency or a separatist movement even when they hamstring or defeat a specific terrorist group. Ethnic terrorists are neither limited geographically nor unique to the current time period. Although the modus operandi of these groups is hardly new, ethnic terrorism as a phenomenon is neglected. It is a distinct phenomenon, different from other types of terrorism. Ethnic terrorism differs considerably from violence committed for ideological, religious, or financial motives. Like other terrorists, ethnic terrorists attempt to influence rival groups and hostile governments. But unlike other terrorists, ethnic terrorists focus on forging a distinct and fostering ethnic mobilization. Yet another goal of many ethnic terrorists is to create a climate of fear among rival groups' population. Because conventional countermeasures against terrorism may unwittingly engender broader support for an ethnic insurgency or political movement, ethnic terrorism poses a dilemma for the state. To illustrate the important role of terrorist groups in ethnic conflict, this paper will examine the experiences of the Kurds in Turkey, the Basques in Spain, Jewish radicals under the British Mandate in Palestine, Tamils in Sri Lanka, and other ethnic struggles. This paper has 3 parts. In the first, I describe ethnic terrorism and consider why it often does not fit standard models of terrorism proposed by students of the subject. In the second, I detail the distinct agenda of ethnic terrorists, as it relates to both their ethnic community in general and to the population as a whole. In the third part, one assess potential means of countering the difficult challenges posed by ethnic terrorists. Characteristics of ethnic terrorism. Ethnic terrorism can be defined as deliberate violence by a subnational ethnic group to advance its cause. Such violence usually focuses either on the creation of a separate state or on the evaluation of the status of one communal group over others. Terrorism committed by communal groups differs in motive and in nature from that committed by leftist or utopian groups. Ethnic terrorists, in contrast, usually focus on the status of a specific segment of the population, not the population.